Welcome to Programming User Interface Lecture. Today we're going to be looking at JavaScript and libraries. So we'll be doing a kind of comprehensive JavaScript review from what we learned in class so far, and then we're going to move on to working with JavaScript libraries. So for the first 20 minutes, we're going to be reviewing vanilla JavaScript commands. So these are the basic things like, finding elements in the DOM, manipulating them, adding new ones, adding events, etc. Then we'll be moving on for the next 20 minutes looking at Jquery again and how to use Jquery, how to get it set up, how to use its specific syntax in commands to make things a little bit easier. And then for the rest of the lecture, we'll be looking at JavaScript libraries. So how to start using library. I've picked out three basic libraries that are pretty popular, and we'll be looking at how to get them working and set up, and then going through an example for each. So feel free, if you are very comfortable with vanilla JavaScript, skip that one. If you're very comfortable with jQuery or you think you got that, skip that one, and you can just jump to the 40-minute mark if you want to continue on. So really just it's up to you based on how comfortable you feel with JavaScript so far. You might want to review everything that we've done up until now, or if you feel good, you can skip ahead to the parts that you feel ready. All right, so let's begin. So the first thing we're going to review is vanilla JavaScript. So we covered this a few weeks ago, looking at how you can just use the built-in APIs that come, basic to web-based JavaScript to interact with the DOM, right? And the DOM is the document object model. These are everything in the web page has an element in this document tree. So if you want to edit the document tree by adding a div or adding a link or adding an image, you have to modify the DOM. And so you need an API or application programming interface to do this. And so JavaScript provides these functions and these methods built into these DOM elements that you can modify the DOM and change things and do everything you can do via code by coding up HTML via JavaScript and this API. So just to review really quickly, we have this get element by ID. So that allows you to select an element on the page, get element by tag name. So you could select by classes. You want to create an element. So this creates a DOM element in memory, and it's not yet added to the page, and then you would need to append it to the page. And so a document, when I say document here, this means just the web page document. There is always a document object, so it always exists. When I say parent node here, you have to have some existing DOM element in the page if you want to add, for example, a child to it. So, you could say document, or you could say body, or something that's, on the page, but you would likely probably get the parent node via one of these other methods. So you probably want to select to find the element you want to use, and then you would append a child to it. And then once you actually have these elements in the DOM in the web page, you can start using these elements or these methods like modifying the inner value of the element, setting the style, setting the attributes, which would be like the href or the src tag, scr tag, source tag. And then you can also do things like add event listeners. So, check for all the various events that can happen in a web page, like clicking, key down, mouse over, all those sorts of good stuff. So let's just use a few of these just as a review to get started. So I created a new blank glitch here. This is just the basic hello web page version of it. So I have my HTML here. And so we talked about where you can put your script tag, right? Because any place you have JavaScript, you have to have a script tag. If you include a script tag in the head of the page, so up in the top part of the page in the head before the body, this script will be run before the body is loaded. So you don't want necessarily, if you're going to be referencing things in the body, you either have to do some a little bit more fancy JavaScript to wait for the page to be finished loading and then execute the JavaScript, or you're writing code that doesn't rely on the page to be loaded for these elements to be rendered for your JavaScript to work. So what we've been doing is putting the script tag actually at the bottom of our body tag. So it's the last thing that is interpreted when the web page loads. So for example, here we're gonna have a div up in here. So let's delete this stock stuff that's in here. And so we're gonna have a div here, and let's call it with an ID equals my div. Okay. So this is a div on the page. Well, let's put a little text in there so it shows up. And so what you can do with vanilla JavaScript is actually select a reference to this element in JavaScript. So you can get a reference to that. And whenever you're working with JavaScript and you want to store a reference to something, then you start using variables, right? So we want to say, okay, I want to get a reference to this div and store it in a variable. And you want it in a variable so you can do things to it. You can modify it and add to it, append to it, modify the contents, etc. So remember, in JavaScript, we define variables with the keyword var. And so we can use our API cheat sheet here by saying, okay, if we want to select an element by the ID, right, we would use this command. So we're going to say var, we'll just call it my div. Right, this doesn't have to be anything related to the ID. This is just my variable. It could be anything. It could be X. It could be Y. It doesn't matter. I'm going to call it my div because it's contextual, right? It makes more sense because that's the name of the ID. And so when you're naming variables, you want to make things make sense to you so you can use them later and you know what they are. So we use the equal sign, the single equal sign to assign value. And then we have this API call, right? This document, which always exists in JavaScript. And then the get element by ID, which is a method built into the document that allows you to retrieve an element. And so you use these parentheses. Inside the parentheses, you pass the parameter that you want to pass to the method. In this case, this method, get element by ID, expects you to pass a string. So a string is always in quotation marks. And it's expecting you to pass an ID name. So it's able to look into the DOM and find that element with that ID name. So in our case, the ID name is my div. So we'll just put that in there. And so what we have been doing when we're learning JavaScript is that we always want to do console log. This doesn't do anything except output the results of whatever you put inside the parentheses or whatever you pass to it. It outputs that to your console in your web browser. And so this is just a really good way to debug your code and to see what's going on and make sure things are working and check when things aren't working, right? So if we run this, if we opened up this page in a new window, this code would execute immediately, right? Because it's just in a script tag. The web page comes through, processes, and then hits this and then executes as JavaScript. So we should see this console log message immediately as soon as the page loads. So let's open this up in a new window and see what happens. Right, so we're going to open up the developers tools. And this is really important as we talked in class. And so we're going to reload and see what it does. All right, so it console logged this, and it gives a reference to the ID that I found, right? So it's actually a real reference to the DOM element in the page, right? That's why it's highlighting it in the actual web browser window. So this is a reference to that div, and then you can do all the things to that div that we talked about, adding children, changing the content, changing the CSS style, etc. So we can see here it also console logged hi, and that says that's happening in the script JS, and that's on line 5. And so if we go back to our project, we can see that there's already a script file here. It's console logging hi, and then that's being included in our head here. So that's why it's also showing up in our console log. All right, so now that we have a reference to a div, we can start doing things like, as I mentioned, changing the content, right? So all we need to do is reference the variable that the pointer to this DOM element is referenced. So our variable is called myDiv. And then we can do things on this list like inner style HTML. So in this case, element is the name of the variable, right? So our element variable is myDiv. So we can just use the inner HTML and set that equal to whatever we want it to be in our new value, right? So if we reload this page, you can kind of see quickly as it refreshed there that one time it changed. So it's loading with the existing value, which is in the DOM, and then as soon as it gets the script runs immediately and changes the inner value, right? So we can do that. We can also set the style attributes. So we can do things like my div dot style dot color equals right. So now you can modify any sort of CSS style that you could do in CSS style sheets or inline by doing something like style equals color, blah, 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 right? But you can do that with JavaScript as well. The only difference is that uh, JavaScript doesn't like variable names like this with hyphens in it. So um, background color would become something like background color. So it goes from this hyphenated version, which is in CSS, to this camel case version, which is typical for JavaScript. So let's try that. My div dot style dot background color equals blue, right? Okay, so that's how you modify attributes, or how you modify the CSS style and the inner text. If you wanted to do something like modify the href or something, right? Or update the URL that it would link to. So say you had a link, right? You had a href equal to Google or something like that. And so if you wanted to modify this, right, you have to have a way to select it, right? So we're going to give it an ID just in this example. My a link. So what you want to do is select it. So you could select it like this, where you store it in a variable, but you could also do something like by chaining these commands together, right? So you could just select it by doing this. And so we're going to select it by our ID name. And then you can also do these things that are built in, right? Like inner HTML. Uh, and then these other options that we could do, right? Get attribute, set attribute. So an attribute would be the href. So if we wanted to do that, we would need to select it again and set attribute. And you have to say which attribute you want to set. And so we're going to set the href, and we're going to set it to, let's say, now it's going to be to Pratt, like Pratt's website. Right. So if we look at this, it should be a link now to Pratt and not to the original Google. So the difference here is that in this first example, I'm setting a variable, right? I'm using a variable to store the pointer to this to the element. In these examples, I'm just chaining it all together, right? So there's really the best practice would probably be to store it in a variable if you're going to be manipulating the element a lot. But if you're just going to do a quick one-off thing and you don't want to spend time, creating variables for every single thing, you can do this kind of other way where you just kind of chain it together. All right. And so the last thing for this review, we wanted to look at this creating elements and appending them, right? So this command creates an element that you in memory, right? So if you wanted to create an element in memory and add it to the page, you have to first kind of instantiate that element first. So you could make a new variable called myElement or something like that. And inside here, you say what kind of element you want to create, right? So let's create an image. Right. So if we create an image, this element's created, but it's not yet in memory anywhere. It's not yet, or it's not yet in the document anywhere, right? And so what we're going to do is we're going to use this old reference that we stored up here to this div and add that element to it. So we can say my div append child, and inside of here we say what do we want to append to it. So now we've created an element in memory, stored it in this reference variable, and then now we're using our reference to this div to actually add it straight into the document, into the web page itself. So if we look to the inspected this, we should see a div here, and then here's our image tag, right? And it's empty because there's nothing in there, so we would need to assign it a value, right? All right, so if we wanted to actually have an image show up, we need to modify the source tag, right? So there is actually an image available to it. So we would set the attribute, and instead of href, we'd set the source for our image that we just created. So let's go get an image really quickly. Let's get one from Giphy. Fitness Theodore. Okay, that sounds great. This looks pretty good. So we just need the link to the image asset itself, right? So here's the link. And so what we do, right, is we just modify the my elements attribute, right? So we'll set attribute. We're setting the source tag, and then whatever we want to set it to. And it's pretty large. Let's see how it looks. Oh, it's not too bad. All right, so that's how you would append a child, right? And then finally, we create the element in memory, we set the attribute, and then we add it to the actual page by appending it to the div that we have already created. So the last thing that we're going to look at quickly is the add event listener, right? And so this is when you have some sort of event on the page and you want to hook into some code to do something with it, right? So an event might be clicking on a button, it might be hovering over something, it might be any number of things that you can do with events on web pages. So let's reuse this element we have here. We created the image and added a listener to it, right? So we'll say my event, my element dot add add event listener. And the event listener takes two parameters: what event you want to listen to. So let's do click, and then what do you want to do when that event happens. So the thing you want to do has to be an action, and so in JavaScript you have to make this a function. And so in JavaScript you define a function by saying the word function. You can pass the event inside of there, and then inside these curly brackets is the code. And so this looks a little strange, right? Because you're like nesting a function inside of a method here, but this is pretty common for JavaScript, doing these kind of like callbacks and kind of closures. So whenever this image is clicked, this function will run. And so you can do whatever you want in here, right? So let's add another attribute. Let's create a new element called hey. And this will be a div. And we'll set the inner HTML of that to the word hey. And then we'll finally just add it back to that div that we've been adding things to already. So that's my div. So we'll say my div dot append child hey, right? This variable that stores a new div element. So if this works, every time we click this exercise cat, we should see a new word added, right? This could be any number of events. This could be mouse over, I believe. So every time the mouse goes over it, and there's a number, there's many events like mouse out, key down, any sort of interaction you can do with your keyboard or mouse, you can do trigger an event with. So I think that's it for the DOM review. And next we'll move on to the next thing we worked on, which was jQuery. All right, so the next review we're going to do is looking at jQuery. And we talked about jQuery as kind of like a JavaScript library. So this is code that's not native to the browser or to JavaScript itself. This is code someone else wrote, and then we're going to be including it in our project as a JavaScript library. So we're importing this code from another source, and we're using it in our project. And basically, jQuery is a fairly old library at this point, but it was designed to unify and simplify all these commands that we've been doing with vanilla JavaScript, right? So, memorizing all these different commands and then having to do each one of them, and they're very verbose and long, and especially 5 or 10 years ago, each browser kind of did this a little bit differently. So jQuery was super important to kind of have one API to control adding and manipulating the DOM and some other utilities. So we did a little activity in class around jQuery, and so we're just going to go through that activity again just as a refresher. So this was the activity that we had, which was basically a series of tasks, right? So we're basically going to do some of the similar things that we just did with the vanilla JavaScript, but using jQuery itself. And so the first thing we need to do if we're going to be using an external JavaScript library is include it in our web page, right? And so here we have the script tag, and instead of just having script, and our code that would go in here, we have a script tag, and then we have the src attribute, and then the URL of where you'd want to load this JavaScript file from. And so here we're using a CDN. So a CDN is an external server that hosts code or hosts files, that you can request to be included in your web page. The difference is that the idea with the CDN is that if everybody used a CDN and everybody had the same link to jQuery, then caching, which is kind of like local storage in your browser would be caching these files, and you wouldn't have to make all these requests. The other option to this would be, for example, how they're doing it here with the script file, actually having the script file on your server and serving it from your server. So, you'd have to decide which is best for you. Of course, the problem with the CDN is that they could turn it off at some point. Google is probably unlikely to depreciate the service, but they could. They've been known to do that before. So, if you do a project now, it could be broken in 5 years or something like that if they turn off the service. Whereas if you hosted it yourself, you control it, and it's always going to be there. So we're including this in our page, and basically jQuery is a library, and a library useful if it provides an API to itself. How do you use it? So if we look at this page, if we open up our developer tools and go to our console, jQuery inserts itself in this variable of the $sign. So this $sign it's a variable. So it's like when we define a variable like var abc equals hello, right? That's a variable. And what jQuery does is define itself as a $sign variable. So it's a little bit weird for a variable to be that kind of like a symbol, but that's kind of the way it's the notation that's done. So jQuery is actually inside of this variable, and it has all these things built into it that can be used. So using this variable, this $sign variable, we can access the jQuery API to do various things that we can do to manipulate the DOM and other utilities. So let's go through each one of these challenges that we did in class as a review, just to kind of refamiliarize ourselves with jQuery, how it works. So the first one says try to add a span to this div on the page with the ID div1 using jQuery. So if we followed through the docs, this is kind of very similar to how you would use any other library, JavaScript library, you'd have to read the documentation for that library and see how they implemented their API or their way of doing things. So basically, when you want to append something using jQuery, you can do $ and then select the thing you want to append to, and then use the append method to add it to the page. So in this case, they're appending an H2 heading to some element with the class container. All right. So if we wanted to append a div to this, or add a span to this div, we could do it in a number of ways using jQuery. But let's try it. So here we have, for our first one, div1. So we're trying to add a span to this div1, a new span. So we have our script tag here already defined for us, and so we access jQuery with the $, which is just the way they do it. And then the first thing you need to do is select what you want to modify. And so here we're going to select this div1. And so just like in CSS selector, you do div1 with the hashtag or octothorpe $. And then there's a number of ways you can do this, right? As we saw in the documentation. So in the documentation, it says you can just add the HTML you want in there, like so. So if we looked at that, there's our new span that was added. And it happens immediately because it's in the page itself. Another way of doing it, though, is shows that you could create a new element using jQuery, the same kind of way that we created new elements using create element with vanilla JavaScript. So this is one way of doing it. Another way of doing it is you can actually create this element first, right? So you could define a new variable and say, new span, and you create the span using jQuery. And so this shorthand command here, we invoke jQuery and we're passing what we want it to do, and it just creates a span. It's not searching for something like this one, it's just creating a new element. And so new span is now basically the equivalent of create element, right? So now that we have a new span, we could use the same API that we use up here and just find it, then append this new variable, which is a reference to a new span. So what's nice about this is that we can modify this while we create it. Whereas in this format, you can't really. This is not really an object that you can manipulate, right? It's just kind of like a string that's being inserted into the document. So with this format, we can do things like, jQuery has ability to set the text, I believe, to something. So here we'd have to look up how to actually do this. So I'd search, Google jQuery set text value. And so they say they have a text method. So I did it incorrectly. I said text equals. The way jQuery wants you to do it is it's actually a method built in, and then inside these parentheses you put text you want to set it to. So then we can see it works. So again, this is like every JavaScript library that you're going to use. You have to figure out how they want you to interact with their library, and then you'd have to follow their instructions. So similarly, jQuery has a way to modify the CSS. I believe it's called style or CSS. Yeah, so you can change the property name and then the value you want to set it to. So if you scroll through this example code, you'd see some examples of how it's being used. And then let's see if there's here it says the property name and then the value. But you have to use the CSS, right? So in vanilla JavaScript, it's style. In this, it's .css. So we say .css, and the property we want to change, color, and we want to change it to bold. So it's all about, and I think this is a little bit different, right? So if since this is not inline, or it's not a function or a method, you can actually say something like background hyphen color equals red. So it's different. Everything's different. You just need to learn how it works. All right. So that was the first one. The second one says, try to add a span to the div on this page with the ID div2 when you press the button with the div2 button using jQuery. And again, here's a link to the documentation on how to do that. And so it says, okay, so jQuery has this thing called on, and you have to define what the on event is, and then there's some way of doing it. So it has an example here. So the jQuery, you initiate jQuery, you find what you want to add the event to, you say on, then you say click, or whatever the event is, and then the function. So it's very similar to our event listener, just slightly different syntax. So let's try that one. So we need to locate the button. So this is the button that has a click associated that we want to add to. So it doesn't do anything now. So we're going to locate that button using jQuery. So it has an ID div, or it has an ID div2 button. So we'll select it, and then we're going to use the on method. And then we say on what, on click, and then the same as the other event listener, we just say, okay, when does click do this function? And so now we want to add a span to the div when it's clicked. So we can just repeat the code that we had before inside of this function and just change where it's going to be added, not div1, but div2. So when we click now, we'll see it's being added. And the final one we have here is trying to change the background color of the div on this page using div3 with jQuery. All right, so we kind of figured that out already. The div is called div3, so we know we can just select it, right? Called div3, and then we have this built-in CSS command where we need to change the background. Oops, color to blue. Or this could be a hex code, right? Or this could be an RGB value, I believe. Or it can be RGBA value. Opacity is the last one, 0.5. Slightly opaque and less opaque. All right. So those were all kind of just shorthand to manipulate the DOM, right? Change stuff in the DOM. What we can now do though is also jQuery has things built in that helps you do other sorts of kind of JavaScript based things. And one of those things is interacting with APIs, right? And so, writing out all the code that connects to another website and download something like a JSON file, which we talked about in class. JSON file is basically a JavaScript object that stores data in a key value pair. And so what jQuery does is it provides you a little helper function called get, which allows you to reach out to an API and return some data, and then it passes that data into this function that you have defined here. So let's take a look at what we already have this API added there. So an API is always just a website, so you can always just load that website in a browser and see what happens. And so this specific website returns, or this specific API returns a random image of a dog as a JSON object, or it's a JSON file. So you can see what a JSON file looks like here in this case, where it has these curly brackets as an object, and it has key value pairs. So the key is always in the quotation marks, and it's the left-hand side value. Then there's a colon, and then the right-hand side value is the value. So the key and the value. So in this case, this object has two keys, message and status, and then the message value is the URL to a dog image, right? And then the status is like, was this request successful or not? So we already have the setup here where it's requesting this data, so it makes the request, and then it passes the data that it gets through to this function, and this is just a variable, so whatever you want to call it, but in this case we're calling it my data. And like I said earlier, we always want to console log things, right? So the only thing it's doing with the data now is console logging it. So let's take a look at what that looks like in the console. So if I refresh it, this is the result that's happening, and we can make sure that by clicking on that and saying, yep, this is the point where it's logging it, and here is the message that's being sent, right? So there's the object, there's a message and the status, the key values. So in jQuery, in JavaScript, because at this point it's not these data structures that it's working with. It has nothing to do with jQuery. These are just JavaScript data structures, strings, numbers, arrays, and objects. So in JavaScript, you can access key value pairs by this dot notation. So we know message is a key, so we can just say dot message, and we can refresh that, and now we're just logging the dot message piece of the object. Another way of referencing it is the square brackets, and you can put the key that you want to access in these square brackets as a string. Same difference. You'd only want to do it this way if the key name was something strange with like a hyphen in it. You'd want to access it this way, because accessing it like this is not valid JavaScript, so it wouldn't work. So you can name the key whatever you want, but if you want to access it using this dot notation, it has to be, a pretty normalized string. All right, so this makes interacting with the API super easy. Just in one line, you can request data and it returns it. And so now what we wanted to do is try to download this API and then do something with the response, right? And so since this is an image of a dog, right? Let's do something with the dog image. So let's create an image and add it to the div floor. So if we were going to create an image, first thing we want to do is create it, right? So we need to make a new variable called dog image or something like that, and we'll use jQuery to create it. We're going to create an image, right? So now we have an image element in memory, and now we just need to do things like modify the source attribute, right? And so I would have to look up how to do that. So I'd search jQuery change attribute. And so this is saying, okay, there's an attr method built into jQuery. And I'm assuming it works similarly, where you pass the element or the source, the attribute you want to change, and then the value you want to change it to, right? So attribute name and then the value, and use the attr. So in our example, we want to change the source attribute, right? So we'd say attr, and then the value, the attribute we want to change is src, and then the value we want to change it to, right, is the URL to the dog image, and that's stored in this piece of data that we're getting back from the API. So in this case, we're just logging it to the console, but we can do anything we want with it, right? So we can set it, the value of it equal to the source attribute. And so now this is all set up. The last thing we need to do is actually add it to div, right? And so what we need to do is find the div, or the element in the page we want to use. And so that's called div4. And then we know from our previous examples, there's an append method And inside there, you just append whatever elements you want to put into the page. In this case, it's our dog image. So if you go back to see this in action, every time we reload it, it would make a new API request, right? And you can actually see the API request in this network tab under this XHR tab. This shows all the kind of like AJAX or asynchronous requests. So here's the API call, as opposed to all the other calls, right? So it still shows up in this big list, but if you're just interested in these kind of API calls that are being made on a web page, you can just go to this XHR page and see what is being requested. All right, so that was the total of the jQuery. And again, jQuery it's out there. It's used very heavily still, so it's useful to know. And I would say it's kind of getting towards the end of its life as far as how people develop web pages, but it's still very useful and it's very ubiquitous. So it's a very useful library to be aware of. All right, so next one we're going to go on to looking at some other JavaScript libraries. The final section we're going to look at is just trying to get some other JavaScript libraries working. And so we're just going to go through 3 different libraries and just try to figure out on the fly how to get them working in a glitch and seeing how the API works and just trying to get some stuff going. So this purpose of doing this is just to kind of get us familiar with looking at finding a library that we want to use and then figuring out exactly by reading the documentation what we need to do to actually get it working. So I picked kind of 3 different libraries at random. These are very well-known libraries that kind of cover different areas. So we're going to try to get Leaflet working, which is useful for displaying maps. We're going to take a quick look at D3.js, which is good for data visualizations, and then we're going to look at P5.js, which is a drawing kind of art generative kind of library. So the first thing we want to do is, if we're going to make a leaflet, right, we want to use leaflet, we need to figure out how to get it included in our project. So what we're going to just do is, just search for leaflet and see what it says. All right, so usually when you find a library you're going to want to use, you're going to want to kind of look for like a quick start guide and see how to get started. So here they're saying, okay, you need to, before writing code, you need to include the resources on your page, right? And so here they're including their library from a CDN, right? Because you're not downloading it, you're using someone else's code, which is fine for us, right? We just want to try to get this started. So it says, include leaflet CSS in the file headed section of your document, include the leaflet JavaScript after the CSS. So for this library to work, for this map library, which is you can draw maps and add stuff to it, we're going to want to include both the JavaScript file and a CSS file. So that might be the case where there's multiple assets you need to include on your page. So let's make a new glitch here. Basic site. And we're going to want to follow their directions, and we're going to add in the CDN distribution of these assets. So we'll add in the style sheet first, like it told us, and then we'll add in the script afterwards. It says very specifically add this after you add the CSS. That's telling us probably that the script uses something in the CSS or it needs to be loaded before the CSS or the script can be used. This is put a div element with a certain ID where you want your map to be. All right, so it says just put this div element somewhere on the page, right? So let's clear out the stuff that's in here just to be very clear what's happening. I'll leave the glitch stuff at the bottom. All right. So we're going to add a div as it's telling us the ID is map ID. And then it says make sure the map container has a defined height, for example, setting it in the CSS. So it's saying, okay, so if you're going to add this div, you know how divs span 100% horizontally, but they're by default they're not. Vertical height is 0 unless there's content in them, right? So it's saying, okay, we got to make this content of the div or have the div a little bit of a height. So we'd have a couple options here, right? We could write a style element here or style attribute here if we wanted to. We could do it in the CSS file that's already included, right? We could just throw it down here. Or we could also just throw it in the header or in the head section. All right, so now we have the CSS set up and the div there, and then it says, okay, setting up the map. Let's create a map. So we're going to copy and paste this. It says set view, right? So that's the lat and long, the latitude and longitude positions, and then it says this is the geographical coordinates. So that's the geographical coordinates, and then the zoom level, right? So let's add this code to our page. So we need to know where to put this, right? So let's do what we've been doing before. We'll just add this script at the bottom and put it in there. Do what else? All right, so it says by default, you need some add a base layer, right? So the way that this map works is that each one of these views, as they change, these are actually images. And so when you zoom out, this holding is an image, but then when you zoom in, this holding is a separate image, right? And that's what the software is doing. It's keeping track of where you are geographically and requesting those different images at the different levels to be displayed. So that's cool, but the problem is you need a server to provide this images. It's called a tile server. So you need a tile server to actually send you these images to your browser. And as you can imagine, there are some free versions of that, but often they want you to have your own account or your own API key to do it. So it says after you initiate the map here, we're going to add this tile layer to the map. So we're going to paste this in here. Right. And so it says you need to have your Mapbox access token. And so Mapbox is just a tile server provider. They give you an API to actually have these tiles being rendered. And so what I did is I signed up for that, and I got us a key that we can use. I put it into our Etherpad from the LMS. So you can go onto the LMS and click on our Etherpad link that's at the top and get this Mapbox key. This is a Mapbox key. So feel free to use that one in your code if you want to try this one. I'm going to replace that here. Key, and then this is all set up defined to use their tile server and everything. So this demo is set up to use Mapbox as the tile server. All right. So if that works, then we should be able to load it and see a map. Yep. Right. And so you could customize this as much as you want, right? So the CSS is controlling how big the div is displayed, and then the div is controlled by the CSS, and right now it's 180 pixels, right? So you can make this, let's make this like a full screen map. So we could say, okay, we want the body to have margin of 0 and padding of 0 to get rid of those borders, right? We don't want the borders. So let's make this, instead of 180 pixels tall, we'll use 100 view height. So that's the viewport height measurement. So it's 100% of the height of the window, right? And so now we have 100% full screen map. So let's also modify this code here. So it says, okay, so it's building the map, right? And this is really kind of, it doesn't really make sense to us, right? Because we don't really know what the library is doing. We just know this is how you instantiate a map, and this is how you use their API to make it work. So we know that from the instructions, this is the initial point, the geographical point it's loading. So let's change that to be center on Pratt Manhattan, right? So let's go Google Maps and get those geographical coordinates for Pratt Manhattan, right? Right. So here's Pratt Manhattan. And if we right click here, we can say what's here, and then it'll actually give us the latitude and longitude. So this is decimal, or this is degree hour minute notation, and then this is decimal notation. And so obviously this tool is using decimal notation. So let's add that in there, and the zoom level is 13. We'll just leave it there and see if this works. All right, so it worked. We're back in New York. Before it was centering on London. And then we could change this from 13 maybe down to 5. Let's see what happens. Oh, it zooms out. Let's do 18. Maybe one more. Let's do 20. Right. So it seems like that's the maximum zoom for this tile map. It doesn't support anything further zoomed in from here. All right. So we have a working map and it loads up on the location we want to do. Let's just look at some other the quick start things just to see what else you could possibly do. And so it says, okay, you can also do other things like draw polygons on the map. You can add markers, etc. So let's do one of these circles. Let's draw a circle. So it says to add a circle, you just draw this, add this code to your code. And what this is doing, right, is saying, okay, it's making a new variable called circle. It's creating a circle, and these are the parameters it's being passed to, right? So this must be where it starts, the origination of it. So let's change that to Pratt's location. The color of the circle, right, is red. The fill color, so the inside color, the fill opacity, so how transparent it should be, and I guess this is the radius, how big it should be. So that's a big red dot. So we can reduce the radius, right? Probably down to like pretty small. Right. So now we added a little point there indicating where Pratt Manhattan is. All right. So that was an example of using Leaflet. Of course, there's much more you can do. You can have pop-ups. You probably wouldn't want to have all this code in line. You'd probably want to have things like event listeners, right? So when the user clicks on something, it does a certain action to the map, or it removes things from the map, right? So you'd have to come in here and read all the directions and go to the documentation and see, how do you do all these things? How do you add a path or a circle or a polygon? How do you remove those things? How do you control what zoom level you're at? Maybe you can automate those things for the user. So by using this documentation, you could do all that, and you just have to program it into your script. All right, so let's try another one. We're going to look at D3JS, which is a data visualization library. It's pretty complicated because it's it's very customizable, but we're going to see if we can maybe get a quick example working in a glitch just to see how it would work and how it could get up and running. So of course, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to figure out how to install D3 for a project. So I'm just going to search for D3JS and go to their homepage. So they have a way of getting started by you can either download the latest version as a zip file, so then you'd have to include it in your project, but they also offer a CDN option. So let's do that. So we're going to make a new glitch project. And we're just going to add in the script to the head of the page. Get rid of everything else. All right, so now we have the library included in our page. let's go back to these examples and see some examples that might be cool to try. So it's D3 is very customizable. So if you spend the effort and time, you can really do some pretty interesting things. You can see people have done all sorts of kind of graphs and hierarchies and networks and bar charts, any sort of kind of chart data analytic things, maps, all sorts of stuff. So let's try to do something fun like a force-directed network. So this is basically a graph of the relationships between characters in Les Miserables. So, when one character interacts with another character, they create a connection, and this is kind of like a social network graph. So they're showing this example off in this observable site. This is kind of like an interactive site that has kind of all the code, but it's a little confusing. So I wanted to get kind of like the original source code of this and not have to go through kind of like this interactive version, because I want to see how they set it up in the HTML page and the CSS and all that. So I just searched for structured graph and GitHub. Maybe this source code's on GitHub. And here's the D3 repo for that. And so this example is going to show us what their HTML looks like. They're including D3, and then they have their script code, and then they have also this data, the data for the graph, right? So it's a JSON file, which we've talked about before. Usually comes from APIs, and then it has the characters, right? And then it has the links between them. So Napoleon. Had some interaction with Muriel, etc. So let's get started by just kind of seeing if we can get this to work in our own instance. So I'm just going to copy and paste, right, all of this code that's here and put it in our page. I don't need to copy the script because the script is already included in ours. So I'm going to add a new script tag to ours. Paste this whole big and they already had a script tag there, so I don't need that one. I don't need this one, right? Right. So I have the script here. And often what you can do is when you're trying to get something to work, you can just kind of run it and see what happens, right? It probably is not going to work because nothing ever works on the first time. So we'll see if we inspect or go to our developers tools, we can kind of click on the console and it will tell us, what's happened, what didn't work where. And so we can see this kind of stack trace, right? It's saying, okay, there was an error here. It started at here, and it also happened at this point. So we can click on there and see what's going on. So it's saying, cannot read property get attribute of null. So it's saying, okay, so we wouldn't necessarily know this, but it's saying, okay, it's trying to select something called SVG. So let's go back to the code and see what they have listed here. So here, if we would have copied and pasted the whole thing, they have an example where they actually create an SVG element, right? So that's what this is trying to select, and I was saying like, oh, I can't select that. So let's actually include everything that they had included here in our script. So we have the script piece there, and then we're also going to add in this style and then this SVG element that they created. So let's see this again, reload and see what happens. All right, so some problems happened again, and then we're going to go down to where it's happening in our code, right? So you can usually see that this stuff is happening in the D3 library itself, and so that's not a problem with the library. It's a problem with the way that we're using the library. So we need to kind of like be a detective and like follow the problem back to the original source. So in this case, it's saying something kicked off on line 48 that caused a problem. There was some error. So if we come here, it's saying, okay, there's some error here with this command in D3. We don't necessarily know exactly what this is doing because we're copying and pasting it, but something with this is not working, right? And this is some D3 command, right? So at this point, you could try to play around with it, but let's take a look at the code again from the example. And you notice here that they're including the script here. They're saying D3 version 4, right? So I think we included, in our example, we are including version 5, right? So, if you start getting these weird errors like this, you could probably assume, okay, there's some change in versions that, this code doesn't work the same way it works in version 4 versus version 5. So you have two options here, right? You could spend some time and try to figure out why this doesn't work in version 5 and kind of troubleshoot it and get it working, or you can just drop your library version to the version that it works, right? This seems like the more simpler answer. All right, so let's see if that made any difference. All right, so now we got a different error. It's saying, okay, try to get this file, miserable.json, and it got 404, right? We know that 404 means not found, so we can kind of assume that this is looking for this file, right? And it's not finding it on the server because, the only thing we have on the server is this HTML and the JavaScript and stuff, right? So we need to add this data file to our server. So what we can do is save it, right? So I clicked on the file. I'm going to say save page as, and I'm just going to save it in my downloads. And all I'm going to do is add it to our project, right? So now this JSON file is included in our project, and when the JavaScript makes a request for it, hopefully it finds it. Okay, so we know it did work because it made a graph, right? And we can see in our network tab when we reload, it actually making a request for that file, right? Because the JavaScript's making a request for it. And here's all that data that's being sent back. All right, so pretty quickly, we got a D3 network working. That's the problem with JavaScript, is that you have to kind of do this kind of detective work and figure out what's going on. So each one of these pieces of this code, right, does something, right? And you can walk through and see, it seems like, okay, this is setting up the environment where the visualization is going to live, right? It created an SVG, or it selected the SVG. So if you wanted to make this full screen, right, you can modify the CSS to make it bigger. This looks like it has something to do with the colors, right? This has something to do with like the network, right? The force-directed network graph simulation. So that's related to that, and this is, looks like it's setting some properties about how powerful the simulation is. And then it looks like it's going through and adding all these links and it's adding the nodes. And you can come in here and say like, oh, it's making a circle. It's setting the R, so maybe that's the radius. So if we wanted things bigger, maybe we could change this to 10 and see what happens. And so now the radius is a little bit bigger. It looks like it's setting what to do when you start dragging things around. And then it looks like all this other stuff is kind of just like boilerplate, causing the script to do the network simulation. All right. So of course, there's a lot to dig into here, but I find that if you're starting off with trying to get something to work, the best way to do is find an example that is already working, and then go through and try to make your kind of adjustments from that point of view, right? So maybe I don't want to make a network visualization about Les Miserables. I want to do my own network visualization, but at least I know now I need my data to be in this format, right? I know I need my code to basically look like this, and I can just go and start modifying from there. So once you get the example working, you can kind of start working backwards and modifying everything to start being exactly what you want it to be. So of course, there's a lot more examples you could dig into here. every type of visualization imaginable. There are some libraries that are built on top of D3. So I know like chart.js is another library that is kind of a more user-friendly library that's built on top of D3. So you don't need to know D3 to make a simple bar chart. You don't have to go through this entire kind of production. So, you really need to think about too also what level of difficulty and what level of detail and nuance you need in your visualization or whatever you're working on to decide whether you could use something like a higher level library like chart.js, or you really do need to be able to modify all these details and all these changes at a more low level thing. All right, so next we'll move on from D3 into our next library. So the last one we're going to look at is kind of a fun one, P5.js. It's a drawing library. It's pretty straightforward, but again, it requires us to figure out how to use it and how to get it working on our site. So of course, like the other ones, we're going to just do a quick search for it. And there's a get started page. And so for this one, they also have a CDN for us, so we'll just use that. So let's begin with just making sure the scripts work is installed on our glitch. Right, and then it says, okay, let's try our first sketch. So this one seems a little bit more simple, right? So compared to like D3 or something like that, that was extremely complicated about getting it working. But for this one, it seems pretty straightforward. So let's try it. So we need to have a script tag, right? And then we have a function here where it is set up, and then when it says draw. So let's see how this works. Yep, it drew a circle or eclipse. So of course you could go into here and do more complicated stuff, right? So it seems like it has a constant variable for us to say if the mouse is pressed or not. And then it seems like this is the main drawing loop, so it happens over and over again. Let's see if it works. All right. So this library makes something like detecting events much more easier than, say, having to do it on your own, right? So it's defining this global variable called mouse is pressed, and if it's true, then the mouse is pressed. So you don't have to go through all those sort of event handlers and stuff like that. This library does it for you. And it's the one part we missed out here is that in the setup function, you could create the canvas to be a little bit bigger. Right, create canvas. So let's try it. Now it's much bigger. So just in a few lines of code, you can create this kind of interactive thing. So what you would do next, though, is say like, okay, I have a certain idea I want to do. I need to go into the reference, right, and see how to do these certain things. I want to know how to do a, something like a square or something else besides a circle, or maybe I want to try something 3D, right? So let's see if we can figure out how to get a 3D thing going. So it says like when you start up, you have to add this WebGL piece to it. And then in your draw, you can draw the background, and then you draw a sphere by just saying sphere. right? And so it drew a 3D sphere for us. And you can go through and play around with all these different options you can do. But compared to something like D3, like I said, this is much more straightforward and a little bit simpler to get into and start playing around with. So I think we'll end there. It goes the gamut from something as kind of complicated as D3 to something as simple as this, and I would say Leaflet is somewhere in the middle. Of course, you need to know what libraries are actually there, are available to use before dig into how to use them. But checking on sites, doing a quick Google search and just looking for the functionality you want to accomplish, and then also the keywords like JavaScript library. You'll often find that something that you've wanted to do or a genre of something you wanted to do is already out there and ready to go. So this will end our library JavaScript section. And so we'll talk again next time. All right, bye.